and we'll just go ahead and get started. Feel free to continue introducing yourself in the chat. Okay, so this large picture of me. As you might remember, I'm Zoe. I'm the person who has been doing part one and part two of the webinar series, and this is our part three. Part one, we discussed domestic violence kind of as a whole and working on trauma-informed approaches to working with people that have experienced domestic violence or intimate partner violence. I'm going to be using those kind of interchangeably in this series. And then, yeah, today we're going to be talking about safety planning and referrals, but I'm still the same person. Okay. But if you all are on your phone or like have a phone and you want to scan this QR code, or you can join at slido.com with the code 4254. Just going to start this webinar with a little bit of a more interactive vibe of what comes to your mind when you think of safety planning. So if anybody has trouble, feel free to also just put it in the chat. But if you want to participate, yeah, it's going to kind of formulate a little web cloud. So that's kind of fun. If anyone wants to put anything in the chat, I can put it in for you and then we can make a giant word cloud. Thank you all for participating also. Being proactive, plan for safety, urgent, protection, action, agenda, multiple plans. Urgent got a lot bigger. So it seems like we're discussing safety planning in an urgent way. Support system, shelter, providing client with support and assistance with resources. I see a couple people still typing. Oh, being prepared also got quite big. Multiple backup plans. Collaboration, I think that's great also. Knowing options. Okay, awesome. Thank you all for helping make this word cloud. It seems like in our group, we're discussing a lot. We're seeing a lot of safety planning that needs to be urgent and also is focused on being prepared. And there's also like a bunch of other things that we've also discussed. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get into it. So who can be involved in domestic violence? You know, we kind of discussed this in the past couple webinars, but in terms of working with survivors, survivors and victims in terms of like the same kind of verbiage, using those interchangeably, and then people who use violence and abusers as interchangeable language, but people who experience or perpetrate violence can be any age. That's supposed to be gender, age, gender, and relation. Perpetrators of domestic violence can be partners, spouses, parents, guardians, roommates, or other family members or cohabitants. So as we kind of discussed in the first webinar, domestic violence does sometimes have a little bit of a different connotation from intimate partner violence because domestic violence also encompasses people not in a romantic type of relationship or romantic or intimate type of relationship with the person, but someone like a roommate or someone you're living with can also constitute grounds for domestic violence. So depending on the living situation as well. And then moving on just a little bit, what is a safety plan? So safety plans are a personalized plan to keep survivors of domestic violence safe. It's an ongoing conversation between like an advocate, so you all, the advocate and the person they're working with, and a survivor regarding their safety. It may or may not be in the form of a written document. It could just be a plan. It could also be kept like on their phone if the person does not have access to the phone. Last session, we kind of discussed tech facilitated abuse as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Or also things like my plan that we discussed last session, that could also be a way to securely keep a safety plan or at least tips on there. Safety plans should always be developed by and with the survivor. So again, the theme and the motif of client self-determination continuing on throughout the entire process. So from disclosure all the way to safety planning. They are also flexible and can change depending on the circumstance of the survivor. So they're not like a static type of document or a static type of plan. As we discussed and we saw in the word cloud, a lot of people were saying things like things might come first, or being flexible or collaborative. That was also a word that was on there. So understanding that the process is a lot more collaborative in nature. If a safety plan is offered as an option, so you or people in your practice or your organization offer safety plans, it is still the client's choice whether and when they would like to work on one. So even though it's something that can always be offered and something that is most likely offered in terms of risk assessment, or if it's deemed necessary, being able to create an effective safety plan requires client self-determination and the desire to work on one collaboratively. Again, emphasizing this is the client safety plan. An advocate provides options and the client decides what is included. So what makes safety planning effective? So we already kind of discussed, it already came to some people's minds that an effective safety plan is collaborative. So, and what we mean by not prescriptive is like we're not prescribing a one size fits all, and we're not telling a survivor exactly what should be in their safety plan, but it should be made together. Survivor-led, not advocate-led, adaptable over time and context. So adapting to whether someone may still be with their partner, may have left their partner, may be in a completely different context. That's really important. So I know that we also discussed it being adaptable and then attuned to trauma responses. So not just saying like, oh, immediately like you're going to leave. Again, there are very different responses, trauma-based or even just biologically based, of what can happen in terms of trauma response. So fight, flight, freeze. We've all heard of those type of things. Freeze is just literally like we're not really going to go anywhere. And that is something that happens when your amygdala is very activated. And then this fawn right here, if people aren't familiar with like the fawn aspect of trauma response, fawn or tend and befriend, if you've ever heard that also, it can be a response to make the best of the situation or try and accommodate or be very friendly with the person using the violence. That is also a survival instinct in humans. So that's also something to really take into account as well. Just understanding that there may be very different trauma responses depending on the client and the survivor, and that will definitely impact the safety plan. Also incorporates harm reduction. So for clients who stay or return, so being able to accommodate and account for harm reduction if somebody may still be with their partner or returns to their partner. That's also something that is effective in safety planning. I also see a question in the chat. Do police departments develop safety plans for domestic violence victims? If anybody else has a different understanding of this, but my understanding is that if the police department is working with a survivor, they'll normally connect the survivor with someone who is more in the field, so like a social worker or a victim advocate who can help with safety planning. But if anybody has a different understanding, or you work with police departments or law enforcement, yeah, feel free to also put in the chat if there are other protocols where you're at. So moving on, when are safety plans appropriate? So safety planning for clients who want to leave, the most dangerous time for a survivor or victim, depending on what language you would like to use, is when they leave their partner that is using violence. 77% of domestic violence related homicides occur upon separation. And then post-COVID, 75% increase of violence upon separation for at least 2 years. So the COVID pandemic did really increase a lot of instances of violence and domestic violence, especially with people who were a lot more confined to certain areas. So that's also something to also take into account with the effects of COVID-19 and what that has done to people's living situations, what that has done to their employment situations, and also just the long-term impacts, health and mental health wise. And stalking and other forms of abuse may increase post-separation. Barriers to leaving, we kind of discussed this in our first section, but some of these can include things like isolation, having children, fear, physical harm, threats of suicide or suicidal ideation from the person utilizing the violence, also economic necessity, hope that partner will change, connection to the partner's well-being, different cultural or family pressures, immigration status or fear of deportation, and then also feeling like there's nowhere to go. And I am based in Arizona. I don't know if I had said that. So the slides in here do have like shelters within Maricopa County, which is in the Phoenix area of Arizona, but also being aware of shelters and resources locally is something also really important when you are working with people that need safety plans. Okay. And then if everybody would like to continue with this, what barriers to leaving do you think are most significant in your work experience? So again, you can use the QR code up here, or I'm going to re-input the website with the code in the chat. But I'd also like to hear what everybody else's experiences are working with survivors. Housing, lack of shelter, lack of money, legal status, children's safety, resources, culture. Yes, if you don't want to like put on here, like feel free to put it in the chat as well. No help to leave, financial, having to find a job, the unknown. Okay, it seems like we're covering a lot of barriers here. Yeah, so it seems like a lot of people are having a lot of very different barriers to leaving, or barriers to like leaving successfully. The population that I work with is immigrants, mainly housing, legal status, family traditions. And it's summarizing it at the top, actually. So legal status and housing seem to have like quite a bit of responses. Also children, family, support, culture. Yeah. It's looking like there's a lot of similar things reflected, and some are actually coming out a lot more than others, I feel, which is interesting. Resources, family support, financial support, economic security. No family support, children, financial, being undocumented, money with the emoji, fear of leaving familiarity. Yes. The commitment to culture and religion in terms of separation or divorce, especially for people who are partnered and married, living with their spouse. Stigma, education, work experience, people not believing their experience. I don't see anyone else typing, so thank you for that. So we can kind of see that there's quite a lot of barriers. There are quite a lot. And of course, like we have a few that are really sticking out. So legal status, support, family and housing or shelter seem to be quite big barriers, quite large barriers. And so we can also keep that into account when we're working with clients or survivors to make sure that our risk assessments and our safety plannings are prioritizing these things that we've been seeing. So thank you for participating in that. So safety looks different for everyone. Culture, religion, gender identity, immigration status, and/or disability can shape safety planning. Intersectionality is important to consider when safety planning. So intersectionality, what we mean by that is the idea that people can have many identities that might experience oppression or experience a lot more barriers. And those things, all of those identities are extremely valid and reasons for individualizing and differentiating safety plannings to accommodate all of those barriers. So that's kind of what we mean by intersectionality. But so if you're looking and working with a person that does not have documentation, so they may not legally be residing in the US, that is like one identity that they have. And also being a woman and being from a country that is not the US, all of those things come together and they influence a lot of how we're going to move about with the safety planning. So what safety measures could be in place, what organizations are safe for them to go to, what organizations are not safe for them to go to, language access, things like that. So making sure you're taking into account the holistic picture and intersectional picture of your client will be increasingly important with safety planning and making sure that these plans are being as individualized and as effective as possible. So safety planning in marginalized communities. So kind of alluding to what I was just talking about, but many of these identities may experience violence differently and may experience violence that's not just at the form of them and their domestic partner or someone they're living with. So BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and Other People of Color. So BIPOC survivors may fear law enforcement, welfare systems, or systems that have commonly been rooted in different racist ideologies or just racist practices. So calling the cops could make things worse is real and like a valid fear. Historic and systemic trauma makes certain formal systems feel unsafe. So if people fear that their children are going to be taken away or fear that they will be put in jail as well, that's something to really take into account, and how people are socialized to see a lot of BIPOC survivors as also aggressors in certain situations. Immigrant and undocumented survivors may face legal barriers, and as we kind of discussed with the responses, that actually was like a really big barrier that a lot of people have been experiencing with their clients. But legal status and the tribulations and all of like the status and the help that needs to be there is also a huge barrier of clients leaving and also clients being able to seek formal help. And then again, just also kind of emphasize that services without proper language accessibility for people that are immigrants will be also a huge barrier. So making sure that any referrals that are given are culturally relevant, culturally safe, and able to provide the necessary help. LGBTQ plus survivors, they are often kind of left out of certain domestic violence services. So shelters may not be inclusive or safe, including things like getting hormones or even just reducing stigma against people of the LGBTQ community. And then abuse may look a little bit different or may involve some different things. So things like outing somebody. Outing somebody means like, I'm going to tell people that don't know you're gay, I'm going to tell them you're gay. That also is a very important aspect of safety planning for this community, because it directly may influence their safety. And then again, other examples where like misgendering is also an interpersonal, could also be interpersonally antagonistic to some people, and then control over medical care. So not allowing a partner to go get hormone replacement therapy after being on that for a very long time, that can also be a form of abuse that is kind of specific to the LGBTQ plus community. So just making sure that we're staying up to date on different forms of education and certain types of abuse that can show up in marginalized communities. Survivors with disabilities, they may need a lot more information on accessible planning. So what are exits to the home that are accessible to you that are not going to cause you any more harm in acute situations like that? And also assessing the relationship with their caregivers. So can their caregiver take care of them? Is the caregiver the person who is using the violence on them? That is also something that will need to be adjusted and taken into account with survivors with disabilities. Also things that factor in mobility, kind of what I was talking about, like, can you get out of the house physically? Medication, do you know where the medication is? Who controls the medication? Do you know the names of your medication? Things like that. And then assistive devices. So things like wheelchairs, crutches, things like scooters, all of those things will need to be taken into account. And also emphasizing that ability status is not just physical, but also making sure that accessible planning is very respectful and accessible for people that have hidden disabilities, have disabilities that are not physical, and just making sure that you're caught up on the resources in your local community that can accommodate those things. So what does that mean for us as advocates and people that work with clients? Don't assume all safety plans involve like cops or shelters every single time. What does safety look like for you as a person? Again, respecting client self-determination, and then using harm reduction and empowerment, not judgment. So, I mean, like, I doubt anyone here would do this after the 3-part series that we've been discussing, but, making sure that we're not asking, like, well, why don't you leave? We've kind of discussed in the previous webinars how that doesn't work. It's not super effective, and it doesn't take into account the client's self-determination and also their history. And safety planning for clients who want to stay. Again, using like a more harm reduction lens. Clients who stay with their partners may face emergency situations, so safety planning for them will also include a lot more acute and quick safety planning measures. So in an emergency, having a clear plan and at least some preparation as much as possible with flexibility built in can help survivors and their children maintain safety. If there are children in the home, they should have an age-appropriate safety plan. So that may look different for each person, but teenagers are a lot different than working with toddlers. So making sure that the age-appropriate plan is communicated in ways that are effective and will stick with certain children without, causing too much distress, but also making sure that the survivor is able to account for their children as well. So myths and misconceptions about safety planning. Once they're out, they're safe. A lot of us know that that's not true. Like there's a lot of increase in stalking, intimate partner homicide, or continued intimate partner violence is definitely still plausible and possible and does still happen. Another myth, only physical abuse requires a plan. We've discussed a lot of different types of abuse and violence throughout this webinar series, so we know that there's also emotional, economic, verbal, psychological, tech facilitated. There's a lot of different types of abuse that can impact a survivor. So there are many different safety plans that can be created that are not just about the physical and physicality of violence. And then the last myth, this plan means that they will leave and not return. So again, we are working with a harm reduction and empowerment lens, not a judgment lens. So that also means that we are going to accept if the safety plan could be executed and then the person could also go back to their partner. That is also, or their living situation. That is a very plausible plan. So making sure that the safety plan that we create is flexible and accounts for both short-term and long-term impacts can help reduce harm and actually be a very big prevention of further harm. Okay, so what is included in a safety plan? We've kind of touched on this a little bit. So security during a violent incident. So creating codes with family, friends, or neighbors that someone could easily text and be like, I need help. Obviously not saying I need help, but code words can help with that. Maintaining proximity to an exit. So a physical exit of the home is very important during like an acute and emergency violent incident. Proximity with an exit is important in a physical sense. And then seeking healthcare for injuries and always for strangulation. Strangulation is a really big factor in intimate partner homicide and intimate partner fatalities. So that's always something that needs to be checked out, especially related to what could happen with blood flow to the brain. So strangulation is always a healthcare type of situation following leaving the situation or getting out of the initial like super violent incident. Firearm safety. Guns should be unloaded and locked in a safe. And of course, like we can't control that at all times, but firearm safety and acknowledgement of firearms is something that should also be completed in or assessed in risk assessment and also thought about within safety planning. If the survivor is able to work with getting those guns or firearms unloaded and locked, that would be the most beneficial. But yes, again, like we can't control everything within the home. Pack a bag. So also introducing the idea that a getaway bag or just like an overnight bag, that type of size and that type of nature, but packing a bag in case someone needs to leave the situation in a very short-term incident, but clothing, toiletries, extra keys, comfort items, and documents. So including like birth certificates, driving licenses, anything that would be needed in a legal situation. And then I'm reading this comment in the chat. It can be very important to have someone with the person when they attempt to take their personal property out or even just pack the bags and to hide safely whatever personal documentation they may have as soon as they start thinking of leaving. Yes, that is also a really important aspect. And yeah, I know that lack of social support was also a barrier that we discussed earlier in the list that we were listing out. But if a client does have a support system, that's also something that can be important to keep into account when creating a safety plan. Thank you for that. Okay, also documents. Birth certificates, social security cards, immigration documents, children's records, so like school records, medical records, and financial information. And then as the chat said, like safely hiding personal documentation can be really important, and thinking about, you can ask a client like, where is a safe place to hide these things? Where do you want to keep these things? So making sure that that's also somewhere within the plan to be proactive as possible. Pets. So find out where your pet can go. If you need to leave, like, can you take the pet with you? Can the pet go somewhere? Keeping extra food and supplies available can be really important in case the pet does go with you or someone else. And this is like an extremely, common situation. Many people have pets. So including pets in the safety plan can help lower anxiety for a lot of survivors, and also just be an important logistical aspect because the pet doesn't want to be in a violent household either. So including pets in the safety plan can be very important and empowering to survivors. Age-appropriate child safety planning, we kind of discussed this earlier, but what should the children do if violence starts? And then what should clients tell their children? So teaching children how to recognize danger without making them responsible. So the children don't have to stop the violence, but children can recognize dangerous situations for their own safety as well as the safety of like the household. Escape routes, safe rooms, and code words. What to do if they can't access a phone, and then who can the children go to? Can they go to teachers? Can they go to neighbors? So that's also something, and some questions that can be asked in a safety plan. Okay, and then security within the home or work or in public. So addressing, what does security look like in the home? Like, are you safe when you go to work? Are you safe in the public? Again, once someone is out of the household, that does not mean that everything is like fine and that everything is over. There are a lot of instances of stalking. There are a lot of instances of retaliation or just harassment post-separation. So making sure that we are addressing and at least asking and planning for security, not only in the home, but with work or in public. Also discussing orders of protection, and also things to consider with orders of protection. So tech facilitated abuse or tracking. That's something we kind of discussed in the last session, but tech facilitated abuse, so like sending inappropriate messages or threatening to send something private of the survivor to everyone else. That's also a form of tech facilitated abuse. Or just like GPS tracking, like, did someone put an air tag on a survivor without them knowing? How can a survivor know, like, if they're being tracked by a certain spyware on their phone, or even things like now Apple, for those that don't know, Apple does have a notification if an unknown air tag is following someone. So also making sure that clients are aware, like, if you get any weird notifications about something that may be following you or may be with you, screenshotting those if like their phone is private to them, but making sure that tech facilitated abuse is also documented, because that's important for orders of protection, and also, as we kind of discussed, more difficult to prove. And then also reading a comment in the chat, where there isn't evidence of physical violence that someone can present to court, it's important to not remove the children if custody is shared, even if violence is real, without a restraining order. So yes, I feel like, yeah, thank you for that comment. Children and custody and legal um, aspects of custody are going to be something that also really need to be taken into account. Um, not only for like short-term safety planning, so getting everybody out of the household if it's violent, but for long-term safety planning and flexibility as well. So also understanding like custody agreements and what those laws are in your local areas. Thank you for that. So things like what might a survivor need to consider other than all the stuff that we already discussed, but also emotional safety and self-care planning. So safety planning is more than just logistics. It's also important to understand how to plan for panic attacks, trauma triggers, that's just supposed to be spiraling, and loneliness post-separation. Oh, shame spiraling. Shame spirals are kind of like the, oh my gosh, what did I just do? Like I put myself in this situation. What am I going to do? What's everyone going to think about me? Those are also those are all very real responses to what could be happening in and outside of a violent intimate partner relationship. So making sure to include emotional support, coping strategies, and maybe even support groups or different resources that people can have for their emotional support and self-care, not only in the moment, but in the long term. So I keep referencing this, but so also crisis versus long-term safety planning. But those two things may look a little bit different for each person. But crisis safety planning, so the immediate and short term, or like the acute, I'm not sure what everybody calls it in their organization. But things to consider include like the safe escape routes, the exits, the code words, the packing your bag, tech safety, and then safe spaces to go, like certain shelters if they're safe, or staying with a friend or something like that. And then long-term safety planning. So those things focus on a little bit different aspects, focusing more on stability and healing. So also housing options after the shelter. So, or after staying with a friend, like can they stay there long term? Is there any opportunity to work towards getting their own place? Applying for orders of protections, custody changes, as we kind of discussed, building financial independence. So things like savings, things like employment, financial literacy, mental health care and community support, and then rebuilding social networks outside of the relationship or the person using the violence. So making sure to continuously build social support and using that as a strength. And then reframing return through a harm reduction lens. So survivors may return to their abuser or the person using violence multiple times. It doesn't mean it's like a failure or anything, or the safety planning like quote unquote didn't work. But on average, it can take, some of you have probably heard the statistic, it can take like around or like up to 7 attempts to permanently leave. Emotional, financial, and family ties are powerful. I mean, we kind of discussed those as huge barriers to leaving. So making sure we're not asking like, why did you go back? But more asking through a harm reduction lens of like, what do you need now for your safety? Also making sure we're providing support without shame or judgment. So emphasizing that survivors require safety, regardless of change and regardless if they go back, a survivor is still deserving of safety. And that means short-term and long-term. And then also honoring that the safety plan is a flexible document. It's not like it's not a static document, but revisiting the safety plan based on new dynamics. So based on what they tell you, based on what's happening currently, maybe they went back like fully living in and integrating back into each other's lives. Maybe they have their own space, but are back in their relationship, but not living together. All of those things will require a lot more flexibility and safety planning. So making sure that that's also taken into account. And then offer practical support for navigating a return. So teaching signs of escalation. So even if it's not like teaching signs of when to leave, because, you know, that depends on the person, but making sure that survivors are aware of escalation or increased danger, and then also helping to set boundaries where possible. Of course, like that's not possible in every situation and every relationship dynamic, but helping to set boundaries where possible, and making sure that those are at least expressed in ways that are safe can also be included for harm reduction and safety planning. Again, this will kind of depend on the situation. Okay, safety planning can be very important for prevention. So up to 75% of domestic violence related homicides happen after leaving. We kind of said that earlier. Safety planning can be life-saving. Safety planning can reduce repeated violence, injury severity, and psychological distress in a variety of ways. It's a trauma-informed intervention. It empowers survivors with agency and with their client self-determination that we discussed. It helps survivors imagine options before crisis hits, so people don't have to discover this all at once or think about this all at once. They already have a plan. Safety planning is a form of primary prevention. So there are primary, secondary, and tertiary forms of prevention. And primary means we're preventing it before anything happens. So keeping survivors connected to resources, not isolated from resources, and making sure those resources are appropriate and effective based on who they are as a person. They can also prevent escalation or re-entry into abusive dynamics. And of course, again, making sure that we're working with a lens of non-judgment and empowerment that may not be linear. The process of not going back to a partner or successfully, or however you are describing it in your organization, like leaving a partner, that process and healing most likely will not be linear, just because that's not how the world works. Also, some trauma-informed tips. Assume trauma is present even if it's not disclosed. Be curious, not confrontational. So not targeting questions like, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you tell anyone? Those can be quite confrontational to people that may have experienced trauma, even if they're not disclosing trauma. Use grounding, not grilling. So kind of along the same lines, not asking all those why questions and expecting someone to have every single answer, but more about, can I check in with how you're feeling right now? Would it help if we pause for a moment? So allowing that experience to be based on the reactions and experiences of the survivor, again, honoring and empowering their agency. Center the choice and the voice of the survivor, so asking permission before giving advice or making a referral. Respecting silences, pacing, and survival strategies. So again, kind of going back to that fight, flight, or freeze, if we notice there's more combative responses, we notice there's no responses, those are also, those could also be due to trauma responses and survival strategies and instincts just biologically built into the brain that has experienced trauma. So making sure that we're utilizing a trauma-informed lens and respecting the silences, the pauses, or the little snappiness. I mean, of course, there's going to be a lot of heightened emotion, so making sure that we're utilizing trauma-informed lenses there. Focus on the small wins, not the giant leaps. So leaving isn't always the first option, and it's not always the only option. That's why safety planning is really important. But supporting safety in the moment, not just the end goal, can also be really important to respect the process and advocate for the client in ways that feel the most safe to them. Okay, and then just making sure that you are aware of certain local and national resources. So one thing that you can do, or your organization can do, or people can do in a group, but thinking about like, where are your local shelters? Where does someone call to get into a shelter? What are your community-based programs and where are those? Are there community-based programs for certain identities that specialize in working with certain people? Are they accessible language-wise, physicality-wise, mobility-wise? Like, are they accessible? Are they accessible by public transport? Things like that in your questionings when you're creating resource lists can be really important. Again, knowing your resources is really essential here. And then our pre and post links weren't working. So I guess in replacement, yeah, if anyone feels comfortable, or you can also just message me privately on this Zoom, but we do hope to get like pre and post acknowledgement of this. If you wouldn't mind telling me if you learned something in the chat, and I'll send that to my AmeriCorps group instead. But that would be extremely helpful for me as well. And I will also go ahead and read comments. We're also ready for questions now. If you would like to provide feedback, that would be great. So I can save this chat and give it to, or not save the chat, but just like save those feedbacks and give them to my lead person at AmeriCorps. That would be great. I will go ahead and also answer questions in the chat. How about putting in the plan or asking the victim, how do you think your former partner will react when they see you with a new partner? If they don't think the former partner will handle it well, what is their plan? I guess that's also if we want to get into like a therapeutic sense of like what is someone's relational responsibility as well. So someone not liking a new partner is not something that's completely in control of the client, but in terms of working with safety, that is something that the client can disclose to their new partner that, hey, I left an abusive situation, or I have a violent ex-boyfriend. That's also up to the comfort if the person wants to self-disclose that they were in an abusive situation to a partner. But just making sure that we're continuing, I think that would fall under the umbrella of making sure that you know that you can assess like tracking. Are they tracking me and my new partner? Are they working? Are they going to come follow me and my new partner? So I think that will depend on the situation, depending on how they think their ex-partner may react. And then a comment, most shelters for domestic violence do not allow anyone to disclose their location for safety reasons. Okay, good to know. Good to know that a lot are not allowing people to or are not disclosing certain situations. Yes, the PowerPoint will be emailed out. If we can, I will double check on the certificate things, but I think that is possible. If you want to just email me. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I'll stay on and continue with certain questions. How can we introduce the subject in a way that doesn't create fear and withdrawal from the survivor? So that that kind of depends on the conversation, but also I think if you're able to kind of like learn certain skills within the motivational interviewing realm of working with clients, but kind of allowing them to come to the idea themselves, or just like allowing them to tell you, like, or you can ask them, do you worry about your safety? Are you comfortable with creating a safety plan? Clients may or may not agree with that, and up to your discretion as the advocate or the service provider. If it's necessary, I think that's something that can be directly said, but also allowing them to accept that they may need a safety plan, and working with them with the fear and withdrawal. So like, again, respecting the silence and just making sure that you're kind of giving space for that. And again, it can be an iterative process, but just making sure that it's an option is very important. Yes, if there are any other questions, I'm also going to put my email in the chat. And also, I believe if you lose my email, you can respond to like the webinar invites and things like that. And it'll go to someone on our team, and then someone on our team can connect you with me. Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'll continue staying on just in case there's some other questions too. Does anyone have any other questions? Thank you. All right, everyone. It's kind of filing down with people. If you have any other questions, please go ahead and email me. My email in the chat. And yeah, I hope you come to our other webinars that we do, but thank you so much.